All right, everyone. Somebody sent me a link to this the other day, which is the Swedendemocrats are now the largest political party in recent polling in Sweden. They're the populists. They're the ones that want to throttle refugee movements in Sweden for Swedish culture, maintain their language, their sort of cultural fabric, and maintain order within their country. It's becoming easier to campaign, I think, because every single night someone throws a grenade or a bomb at a police car or burns a house down or goes crazy and there's like killings. I would think after a while, when you've got a nation that 20 years ago was, to outsiders, speaking as an American, when you thought of Sweden, you thought of an extremely safe, extremely technologically advanced, highly literate society that was a little bit wonky and weird, like maybe behaviorally, like there was some weird shit going on there, but very, very literate, very, very respectable and safe, and you could go there and nobody had any problems, stuff like that. That's sort of the stereotype. Or you go back 20 years beyond that, it's basically fucking disco land. It's like, okay, other than the drugs, it's basically like a bunch of elves dancing around with a disco ball. And that's how Americans perceived, no, well, not just Sweden, but Scandinavia, Northern Europe in general. Now it's overrun by violence and crime. The thing is, the perception is always different from the reality. The reality is that even though the crime rate is considerably higher, it's still relatively safe as a country. But the perception is when you go from 2 murders a year in your city to 20 murders a year in your city, even if it's not nearly as high as living in, I don't know, the middle of Detroit or something, it's a lot higher. The perception is going to be different among people that have actually been there in the better times. What I've warned of for years now, I think, didn't I start making these warnings in 2014 that what was happening in Europe was that you were going to see the rise of parties that were more on the right and the rise of movements on the left. You were going to see more fervor, more candor among these groups of people. They were going to be more pushy. They would be more powerful. The central government, the centrists of the old paradigm, that has stopped working because the world situation is not the same way that it was during the atomic arms race. It's not the 50s or the 60s anymore. Economics is different. Communications, travel, diplomacy is different. The world's grand chessboard looks different. Everything is different. But we're using, in some cases, the same kind of diplomatic and social strategies as before. For instance, United States. This has nothing to do with Sweden. United States. Why do you think we have Trump populism right now? Why do you think people are concerned? The immigration overhaul that we signed back in the 1960s in order to outflank communism no longer makes sense. Saying, well, the United States, we've got this vast area of land, and even post-Homestead Act, a lot of it is extremely rural, and it was back in the 60s. You got to realize that. How much was our population back then? Wasn't 400 million, I'll tell you that much. We figured, hey, we can rapidly become even more of an economic juggernaut. All we need is more people. We need to settle more people. We need to build the cities larger. We need more industry, more extraction of goods, more manpower potentially. We can therefore outflank these countries that tend to lose population. Like Russia had been losing population through starvation, through execution, and through emigration. And this was a problem in the Soviet bloc. They were losing population because of bad economic scenarios brought on by communism, which is always a cancer on your economy, number one, and by purges, by tyranny, number two. The U.S. said, well, the commies, we're going to cast them as intolerant and unlovable, like cold and dismal, and you can't get ahead. You can come here, though. They overhauled the immigration system to coordinate this in order to drain academics from other countries, the more skilled, more wealthy people in some cases, people who would go on to invest, and they were in Hollywood or whatever. They did this. Made sense at the time to outflank communism. It no longer does. Who are we trying to outflank? There's no reason to anymore. The idea that you can pack hundreds of millions more people in without conditions getting more crowded and potentially more problematic in some parts of the United States, that's no longer the scenario. Just because it was a virtue in 1965 doesn't mean it's a virtue in 2020. You're talking you're talking more than half a century later, and we're still using the basic same premise. And people have it in their heads that new paradigm that was built because of the nuclear arms race has to be maintained or you're a bigot. Well, it has nothing to do with that. It wasn't imposed in the first place. The immigration overhaul in the United States, again deviating from Sweden for a moment to make a large point here. The reason had nothing to do with, well, we need more tolerance. We're too white. The U.S. is 95% white people. We need to change it. That wasn't why. It was because of economics. It was because we wanted to outflank communism. Now, of course, leftism encroaching on the United States specifically in part because of the immigration situation. Again, it's not bigoted to make this proposal. That's simply the paradigm shift that has occurred. That's simply what's occurred. If you don't have a problem with that, that's one thing. But if you're talking about pragmatic governance in terms of job stability and wage growth and purely economic factors, it doesn't make sense anymore. We're not the same nation we were in the 60s, and the threats we face aren't the same. Onward to Sweden. What's happened is that the paradigm that the centrists represent, that their average government represents, is different now. The paradigm has shifted, but their governance remains the same. And so people are casting about for new solutions. Now, the real solution is, hey, people suggested reform. Oh, we're tired of taking so many people from other countries that are continuously not assimilating and causing, therefore, crime, because you get these insular communities. They're segregated by religion and language, if for no other reason. This is the truth. This is what happens to groups of people that come in large numbers. Happened in the U.S. with Irish people. They formed their own enclaves. It took a long time for assimilation to actually occur. A lot of those people were thrown at the Confederacy in the form of Irish brigades in the Civil War. They said, oh yeah, come to America, the land of the free. By the way, sign this paper, we'll give you bread and soup. They sent them off to die. Yeah, by the way, that was also very, very progressive and tolerant and everything. It's what it was cast off as by the proponents of absorbing more manpower for the Civil War, I guess. Hey, these people are penniless. Put them in the army. Hate to sound like Bernie Sanders for a second there, not my intent. So the problem is this. The centrist parties, the old norm parties of Europe, they no longer govern. They no longer function. They're incapable of addressing the concerns of people. So you have groups like AFD or the Swedish Democrats or Front National or UKIP/Brexit Party, these groups providing answers that are novel to problems that are not being addressed by the lame establishment. The lame establishment tells you, sit down, shut up, things are as good as they can get, don't be a bigot. We were told that in the United States, and we told them to fuck themselves. That's exactly what Obama represented, which is why Biden is doomed, by the way. Barack Obama said in no uncertain terms to the American people, and again, you can believe that this is justified or true or progressive or whatever you want. Go ahead. But optically speaking, it's perceived of as negative, and it's not a good idea to tell any group of people that has any great degree of patriotism something like this. We were told we had to make do with less impact on the world stage, less wealth per capita, smaller everything, smaller homes, smaller cars, smaller meals. Get used to receding into the pages of history and being just a power instead of the monopolar great power of the Western Hemisphere. We were told we needed to manage our decline. And we said no. We said fuck off. That's basically what we did. Since then, Obama's legacy has been basically completely destroyed. Virtually nothing he so-called accomplished has been left intact. Name anything that Obama's done that's not either hazarded right now, which is Obamacare, or completely done away with. There is nothing. Even the end of the Cuba embargo, which I supported, has been hazarded in part by U.S. action. That's one thing, by the way, I agree with Obama on, but it's a minor proposal in comparison to all of the things that he did. Oh yeah, and fracking, where the only reason that he got that through is because he deviated from everyone in his party telling him that he needed to put up more solar panels and ban oil companies. Okay, that was, by the way, Obama's major victory while in office, was standing out of the way of an energy boom. We still see the fruits of that today. The left, by the way, wants to put the genie back in the bottle. Well, both Sanders and Warren are campaigning on we hate the fossil fuel companies right now. You want to see 10 million jobs dry up? Just elect them. As far as Sweden goes, though, when you've got a bunch of attacks, xenophobic attacks against the native Swedish population by groups of people that for various ideological and political reasons don't like them, they're going to seek to address that grievance. The only way they can do that is by kicking out the centrists in power. Therefore, and this is the other part of the story, the prime minister there, who's a centrist, he's not a Swedish Democrat, he's not a member of any far left or far left movement, he's considered an average politician there, has proposed drastically limiting refugee movements. That's funny, because a couple of years ago, any suggestion like that got you labeled a Nazi in Sweden. You were called a bigot. And the Prime Minister of Sweden right now is one of the people who would say those sorts of things. How interesting that he's now proposing exactly what he said was evidence of Nazism among his political opponents. But I'll tell you what'll happen. Too little, too late. The Swedish Democrats have already basically won. The fact that they've forced the government to capitulate to that particular central demand that they've made in a half-assed way means that they've already won. And guess what? When people are choosing between Prime Minister who wants to limit the refugees 90%, Swedish Democrats who want to limit them 100%, and the far left that doesn't want to limit them, they've obviously rejected the far left message, but guess what? People who backed the centrists, here's the effect, and you need to understand this to understand politics. The half-assed line won't win. The fact that that's the entrenched majority, if you're voting based on that single issue, you're going to vote for the Swedish Democrats or the left. Because if you like the fact that there are refugee and mass migrant movements, you're going to vote for the left. The Prime Minister's saying he wants to limit the refugee movements. Well, that's bigoted. They were told that that was Nazism. Well, they're not going to vote for that Nazi. So they'll vote for the far left. The rest of them will vote for the Swedish Democrats who already have double-digit support. Therefore, the populistic right will win. They will end up governing Sweden. This is my prediction. It may not happen in the next election, but in fairly quick time, the Swedish Democrats or some comparable group will govern Sweden. They'll probably have a solid majority at some point. If the Swedish government attempts to suppress this, and this is the real threat to these countries, this is a dire warning for the European states. If you attempt to suppress a movement that is basically just saying we're tired of the same migratory movements, they're not purging anyone, they're not proposing violence, they're simply proposing shutting off the spigot to address your crime problem. That is not a fanatic proposal. It is not bigoted. It is not evidence of fascism in any meaningful way, shape, or form. If you refuse that, if you attempt to suppress them, ban them, whatever you do, other groups will come along that are even more fervent. The centrists, having weathered the first stage of grief, will then go on to the second and they will be torn apart. The left will no longer be a green party, it'll be communists. The right will no longer be the Swedish Democrats proposing essentially cultural liberalism. It will be Nazis or some comparable group. They'll take up arms and they'll rip your state apart. We've seen this before, by the way. This was the precursor to the Second World War. What the fuck happened? The old center dies and gets replaced by groups that at first are not making fanatic proposals, but when they are suppressed, it allows the more fanatic elements to take control of those movements, or for new movements that are more fanatic to take root because of the suppression. If you suppress, it's like if you say, well, I'm going to get rid of the crabgrass out of my garden, but you don't do anything to keep the thistles from moving in. Well, now you can't even walk out in your garden. It's worse. The situation's not better. It's worse. And so the Swedish Democrats should be allowed to govern the country. Let them solve the problems that the center obviously doesn't want to solve. And as far as the Prime Minister saying, oh, I'm going to be a Swedish Democrat light, it's not going to work. Worst possible thing you could do. You'd be better off going far left and saying, no, we will never capitulate. They are Nazis. You'd be better off sticking to your fanatic guns and pretending that the center represents leftism. That's ultimately, they'd be better off doing that strategically speaking. Maybe not culturally. Be bad for Sweden if they maintain control, because Sweden would slowly devolve into grenade attack land even more than it is now, but they might maintain governance for at least a while. That's about all. Peace out.